Hi, this is kind of a surprise video. I didn't expect to do this video late at night, but this is the third video I'm recording today. I had watched a movie reaction to the amazing movie Field of Dreams, film I've seen before a few times, uh, and it's nice the film reviewer, not film reviewer, the person seeing it for the first time. Um, uh, Awesome. Her name is Awesome. Oh, I'm blanking on. Anyway, Awesome Ashley. I think something like that. Anyway, um, that combined with what I had talked about in my earlier video about desires and thoughts in high school and wishes and wants and so forth, and my my thoughts about writer's block. I mean, my struggle with writer's block and something, which is something I'm trying to overcome. I'm trying to learn how to write music, and I scanned my earlier screenplays and so forth into a huge volume you can be able to find in my Amazon account. It's Jeffrey Linehan, GeoffreyLinehan. I have a few items up there already, a few books up there already. This one is my story work, because it's about my work on writing stories. I plan to have there's a short essay I wrote. So far it's 15 pages. It's, I mean, typed out without the fancy beginning matter and the front matter and the end matter. It's a 15-page essay about my uh, entry into Star Trek fandom and my experiences in Star Trek fandom. I'm holding out until I can be sure that I've thought of everything I'd want to include. But all right, going back to this, I had written down I had written down these things just a moment ago. These items. It shows some sense of how I write my stories. You see, in the mid 90s, I had been in college. Sorry, I have like bed hair. In the mid 90s, I simply had an idea. It was one of which was a thriller involving these different tropes in UFO lore. It was a subject I knew very well, and I simply had a general idea about how I wanted the story to progress, and I would type out scenes. Each day I'd type out scenes. And things were very different back then in my life because my work schedule was more structured, number one, and two, I didn't have as many obligations outside that. So when I had free time, I could simply write or type actually in a computer, and I didn't outline as much. Now that was Cerberus, and before that, um, I had I started off with a story, a mermaid story, and I basically listed out the scenes I wanted to write, um, and then filled them in terms of what happened, the drama. I fleshed out each scene from the outline, and then came Cerberus in 1997, and then a year later I did a James Bond parody called Sorry Wrong Movie, and I remember doing another movie. By the way, the mermaid story was called Acre in Utopia, and I was working on uh, uh, ideas and backgrounds that I already knew, like UFOs and to some extent Mermaid. And I had seen all the James Bond movies up until that point, so I picked up the tropes very well. It was easy to write a new story using like formulaic patterns. There's an opening sequence of James Bond, and then he gets a certain mission, and then he goes on the mission, and there's a top villain and a secondary villain and a Bond girl and so forth. So I was following that, and it was pretty easy. Excuse me. And then I went to. I tell this a lot, but excuse me. It's worth talking about to clear the air, to open up about how I've written these things. That was 98, and then still in 98, for a course, college course, I wrote something called Manhattan Masquerade. I simply had thought of Madonna and what would happen if I met her. Um, I had written something earlier that was a parody of her public marriage with Sean Penn, although I changed names, but and used a very weak disguise of the names. It was for a college course and so forth. But anyway, so I'll tell you what I had in mind at the time. I had in mind The Taming of the Shrew, I think. There was a point when I thought about the novel Cyrano, or the play Cyrano de Bergerac, but I didn't really use that. I used perhaps some elements from it, perhaps, I don't remember, but primarily it was The Taming of the Shrew. I just took elements from that and adapted it to modern times with the thought of a 1980s soundtrack, 1980s icons, an aspect of commentary on the social classes being very blatant in the 1980s, something about how black men still felt like a minority, and also from screwball comedy elements, because I had learned in an interview that she enjoyed when she was on tour, or she was doing promotions for, I think it was it wasn't Who's That Girl. I'm pretty sure it was the one where she was in, was it China? And it was around the turn of the century. I'm blanking on the name of the movie. But actually, yeah, it was with Sean Penn, and I'm blanking on the name of the movie. Anyway, so she said it was like those screwball comedies, and the way she worded it seemed like she enjoyed them. So I thought I would do this as a screwball comedy, and I watched a lot of them. I watched I watched Doctor in the House. Was it Doctor in the House? No, Doctor Takes a Wife. I watched Bringing Up Baby, which is one of my favorites. I watched Crazy. No, I want to say Man Crazy. That's a different movie. Love Crazy. I watched Love Crazy, which is another good film. And I watched, I even bought a book, or I borrowed the book and then I subsequently bought it, about screwball comedies from the 1930s and 40s. What I wanted to do was do them, but update them and alter some of the comedy. In other words, go in the spirit, write it in the spirit of the 1930s and 40s comedies, what they were doing for their time, but update it. So it was whereas they were doing it in New York City, I would do it. I also actually did the screenplay. I set the screenplay in New York City. Now the plot is that Jacob Robespierre, which is named after the Jacobians and Robespierre in the French Revolution, because this is like a class, commenting on a class society, and in New York, and you're breaking through. which is what I felt I was wanting to do. It was like a fantasy. I wanted to break through social barriers and class barriers. In some sense, this is sort of like not exactly a rags to riches, but like a fantasy where you break through into meeting someone who's of an upper crust, and the crux of that was that the two. I mean, granted, okay, this is a fantasy. Just take, understandably, this was a fantasy in my mind. That I would meet, or this character would meet Madonna, and that we would have things in common, and that on a creative end, we would find things in common, we would bond, despite the fact that superficially we're from two different worlds. So I had in my mind a fast paced, suspenseful manner of doing comedy, like Get Smart, the TV show Get Smart, uh, and Indiana Jones, which was big in the 1980s, and other fast paced films that could easily slip into comedy. Um, and I had this theme about illusions and seeing what's on the surface and not necessarily seeing what's underneath the superficiality. And it all blended together thematically. So I finished the screenplay and got a high grade, A or something. I got a good grade in the course, and then I sent it to CAA, and then got it sent back, and they weren't interested. I still have the letter, and I've mentioned that before. But the whole point is, like in Bringing Up Baby, the two of them meet. She doesn't realize that Jacob is not this stockbroker, uh, that he's just an assistant, like an underling in the stock exchange, the New York Stock Exchange, but he's not a big stockbroker. And I had Marius actually being a stockbroker, and then this subplot with Monet, like money. And I realized one weakness in the plot, in the script, I admit, was that the humor was too on the nose. Perhaps some of it was too on the nose. I think some of it was pretty clever. So part of it was adapted from Bringing Up Baby. In other words, the two of them bump into each other. There's a whereas regular comedies have a meet cute, in screwball comedies it tends to be a not so cute meet, and then he keeps throwing her off. I mean, I unintentionally, like, throwing her off from her efforts to get to Los Angeles to film the music video for Material Girl. And although I don't have it in the actual script, anybody who knows what happened when she was filming Material Girl knows that she met Sean Penn, and then her life changed from that point onward. So I know that I couldn't set it after that point, but I thought it would be interesting if it was set before that. And it was for this little brief period of time where the two meet and they get to know each other. And so that's how it was set. And it's kind of bittersweet. It would end on a happy tone because she gets to Los Angeles, and she films it. And he's happy to have met her, but it's bittersweet for anybody who knows what happens when she is filming the video. Anyway, so there were different tropes in screwball comedy that I put in, and drinking is more of a thing now. It's more acceptable in the 1980s, but I don't think I actually put it in. But I've gone to it in the past was it 25 years, however long I've been, it's 1998, however long since then it's been. I thought about drugs and certain kinds of drugs that make you high. Not that I endorse drugs, but I was trying to adapt the comedy and the tropes from the 30s and 40s into the 1980s. I hope that you see that as a good example. I wasn't I wasn't literally using outdated elements. I was taking the underlying trope elements from those screwball comedies and modernizing them. Um, so so going back to the way I write screenplays, I did that and I took this more seriously than I had in the other scripts, I think. And I say that in the sense that there was more involved. There were more elements that I was playing with when putting them in. I wasn't just typing as I went along. I wasn't just inserting new scenes and knowing vaguely where they would fit in the overall story. Um, I had something to go by. Again, I had something to go by, which was The Taming of the Shrew. I think it was The Taming of the Shrew I was adapting. Anyway, in all those stories, I was adapting something. I was taking from something. And the thought just occurred to me to mention this, but I've looked through how George Lucas did Star Wars, and I know he took elements from The Hidden Fortress, and I know other screenwriters and film directors, producers have taken from other works, um, sometimes like sequentially, somewhat more often than I thought they did. I would watch Star Wars and I would marvel at how much was in and how could they think up this whole story and other stories. And I imagine the more I probe into these things, the more I'll find that they were really kind of hidden adaptations of earlier stories. Uh, so maybe I was not far off initially anyway. I just needed more practice and experience writing these. So I I finished in 1998. I finished Manhattan Masquerade, and then I got the letter back saying they weren't interested, and then I kept going back, and I focused on outlining. I focused on how to write a treatment, what's the structure, how to structure an outline, the difference between an outline and a treatment. Was I focused too much on that and not on writing the story itself? The jury is still out, in my opinion. Um, now that I know more, I know simply that an outline is a shorter version of a treatment. I think, and I don't want to say I was hiding behind it. In terms of focusing on how to write treatments, um, I think it was a matter of me knowing, first of all, that this had to be a script. If I was going to show it to Madonna or anybody else, this had to be a script that was really well done and strong on the sake of that. Number two, the more I figured out elements of Kabbalah to incorporate into it, and not only Kabbalah, but 1930s screwball comedy and elements of the 1980s, like icons of the 1980s, and this close bonding that I wanted to portray. I knew it had to be done well. When I say close bonding, I mean like on some level, like two people you think wouldn't relate at all, they have nothing in common, but their core personalities or their core identities, um, there's some level of like kinship, and that's what I wanted to capture. It was a fantasy. I mean, obviously, it was. I confess, I admit, like it was a fantasy. And the same thing, like I would have for Steven Spielberg. Like, there's a kinship. I think there would be, if I met Steven Spielberg, there'd probably be some kind of kinship. Um. Anyway, um. So I knew it had to utilize. It had to portray these elements very well and skillfully switch from one to the other so that it's clear. On one level, it's as clear and comes across mimicking a typical 1980s movie. Of course, later on, I focused more on not just 1980s movies in general, but I knew that it had to be in a certain genre. And that's where Dramatica finally came in. I've mentioned Dramatica before, but I'll give you a brief explanation of it. It was a theory developed by two film creators uh, who did a film, and they realized before they went to do a second film, they'd better get some experience. They wanted to understand how film is structured and written, just as I was. So after 10 years, they came back and they spent a few years doing it took me a long time to trying to figure out. They came up with a theoretical model, like an actual diagram with a full-fledged theory that you could test against. It's predictive. You could test against films and stories and TV shows and so forth. So I have it, and I know the theory pretty well now. It took a long time in order to understand it. That's one of the drawbacks. There's a long learning curve, but once you learn it, it's very easy to work with and think about. And it also destroyed some assumptions that I had about film structure. Uh, so so I knew that I wanted to blend these different elements in cleanly and clearly so that it wouldn't go over the heads of people. It wouldn't be, those things wouldn't be missed by readers. So I used Dramatica, and it took me a long time to figure out Dramatica. I wanted to understand how to use Dramatica in such a way that when I'm writing it, I'm writing it in a way that it doesn't seem like I used a computer program. I wasn't working off of some model. I wanted to make it seem like it's natural, came out of my mind. So, so that's some of what I wanted to uncover about my writing and like writer's block and so forth. A key element. All right, in dramatic. Okay, so from my point of view, I had this thing with meeting Madonna. What would that be like? And then I also had this Taming of the Shrew plot. And what I discovered, and of course, the main character is going through his own arc, his own character arc. What I discovered in Dramatica is that I wasn't that far off. The Dramatica theory, now this was in 1998 that I thought of this, but I discovered Dramatica in 2012. The Dramatica theory says that there are four through lines that arc throughout the story. Like simultaneously, there are four different arcs going over the course of the story. There's one that's the main character, there's one that's the objective story, there's one that's the impact character, specifically not just the impact character personally himself, but the impact character's influence on the main character. And then there's the subjective story, which is basically character relationships and what's sort of called the heart of it. If the objective story is the head, the chess pieces, we've got to destroy the rebels, we've got to fight the Civil War, and we've got to win this, we've got to get the ET alien back to his home planet. That's the objective story. The character relationships, that's the heart of the story. So I wasn't that far off in 1998. noticing these things. I just didn't have a theory that would put it all together in some kind of larger mechanism, some kind of larger theoretical understanding. So good, it's still recording. um, so the way my mind works, it had clearly the relationship, which would be Madonna and Jacob, which later changed to Joe. I want to publish more on the evolution of this story, the evolution of this script project. So there was that. There was Joe would be the main character. Originally, I had Madonna simply because she was the change character, but this kept switching back and forth. Who was the change character at the end, and who was the main character, and so forth. But anyway, there was Joe was one character, Madonna was another character, and there were the logistics of her trying to get to Los Angeles and these other characters getting in her way and so forth. It was a farce. So I realized I had some of those elements anyway. Like when I said, all right, when I said the Taming of the Shrew, like when I was adapting Taming of the Shrew, that's more like the objective story. That's the like mechanism. That's the what story am I adapting and incorporating? You know, what story am I taking and then incorporating this relationship, this burgeoning, budding relationship between Joe and Madonna into. And the objective story changed over time. At the beginning, it was Taming of the Shrew, and then I think the next incarnation was a parody of the O.J. Simpson trial, where I found it interesting. I mean, not to be besmirch. I mean, it was a real serious trial, but it was also interesting how the public was taking to it like a reality TV show. And I thought, I wonder if you could parody that or spoof that, satirize that by changing her life so as to advertise their own products in a weird, twisted way. I mean, it's a comedy. I always intended this to be a comedy. What if you could alter her fate in order to inject these different products? And how I don't want to say legal, how ethical was that? So that was one plot, and then I changed it to music because I figured if she's a music star, it had to really be in the world of music. So I had something about a parody of, or a satire of this conspiracy theory that musicians are really programmed sleeper agents. And I had this thing about the Cold War. It takes place in the 1980s, so I figured I could have Russian or Soviet agents covertly in the United States trying to fit in and pretend to be Americans, and the comedy that they're not really fitting in very well. We are true, picture true, Russian accent. Yes, we are true American people, American citizens. We love Ronald Reagan. They're not pulling it off very well. So like a Cold War parody. See, at this point, I realized something that I didn't realize before with adapting Taming of the Shrew, which was genre meant a lot. I thought that bringing up Baby and screwball comedy was enough to say what the genre was. But no, that's a way of telling the story, but that's not genre. So when I got to changing it to this Cold War thing, that's when I was thinking, oh, like a thriller would be an example of a genre, and that's different from a suspense, different from a horror, different from a comedy romance and a romantic comedy and so forth. I had to pin it down more specifically. not just saying it's a science fiction thing or a screwball comedy thing, but no, what kind of genre is it? So I had an interesting element where Madonna comes across evidence that there are sleeper agents, and she wonders how was she a sleeper agent? Were things fixed so that she could become a celebrity almost overnight? I hesitate to say that because the real Madonna would probably say, "No way." It took a lot of effort to get where I am, but but I thought it was interesting that maybe the character in the story, if whether I did use Madonna or a fake name, which I came up with, either I did or a writing partner did, Farah, because at that point I had already figured out that I'd want to have an allusion to the Joseph and Pharaoh story, where Joseph is able to interpret dreams, and it's a rags to riches story, which would be akin to this, where Madonna or Farah, this celebrity, is kind of like Pharaoh personally, who um, recognizes the talent in Joseph, and then elevates him, and things are better. In the Joseph story, he goes from prison literally to having authority over all of Egypt and the admiration of the Pharaoh. So in this story, almost all along, I had some sense that I wanted this close bond uh, 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 that the two begin to admire each other. Um, so where was I going with that? Oh, so it could have been Farah. So if I couldn't use Madonna or didn't want to use Madonna's name, I could make it a rock star of the time and have her name be Farah, which sounds like Pharaoh. And uh, at this point, I had already changed his name to Joe, like Joseph. Again, trying not to hit people over the head, but trying to make it very clear what I'm alluding to. Um, this is a long. I keep glancing down at this list I wrote of different themes that have nothing to do with very little to do with what I'm talking about here. But this is worthwhile. This is really worthwhile to talk about. So I guess I'll cover this later. Um, the Madonna story thing later. Um, so I wanted to mention these four, or these four, more than four, five um, ideas I wrote down just a moment ago, or at least about 40 minutes ago. um, um, they're simply fantasies that I'd want to write stories about, and I'd have to find some kind of objective story scenario to put them in. I guess I tend to come up with. Um, all right, I'm going to take a re. I'm going to backtrack my words a little bit. Starting off, I told you before this short history. Acre in Utopia about the mermaid story, and then after that, Cerberus, and then the James Bond parody, Sorry, Wrong Movie, and then the Madonna movie, Manhattan Masquerade. The first one, Acre in Utopia, was very much inspired by, first of all, I like mermaids. I want to do a mermaid story. Um, and the idea of having something alien that's captured from the sea, but captured, and um, a sense of communication that forms between the two of them as she mutates from like more of a fish animal to more of a human animal, more of a human. Um, and I'll tell you the inspiration for that. I will actually tell you two inspirations for it. I was listening to the Larry King Show on the radio, and Rosanna Arquette came on, and I had never seen her before, but I liked her cute voice, and so did Larry King, because he um, there was some um, flirting during the show. Um, so I just thought of a cute mermaid, and I thought of a story. What if? So that goes into another idea, another image I had in mind. I had, if you've ever seen Splash, there's a moment when Madison is in the tank. She's the mermaid, and she's in the tank, and there's no communication. But one of the scientists there sees her and looks at her through the tank, and he has regrets about having captured her and so forth. So I took that image and I thought, how would they communicate with each other? And that's the true inspiration. Those elements were the true inspirations for the story, Acre and Utopia. Um, I forget how Acre and Utopia. I would have taken it from a quote somewhere, and I looked up the quote, and I forget where the quote is. It's a merging of a longer quote into something shorter, Acre and Utopia. Um, that's where that came from. So my the way my mind works, my creative mind works, it tends to come up with the main character very deeply, and the bonding or whatever the main character is going through. Then I go to my next script, which was Cerberus, which dealt with all these different tropes about UFO lore. Something I knew very much about, having read about them since earlier childhood, anyway. Um, so I just had the ship crash in the ocean, and then all these different groups were trying to recover it, be the first ones to recover it, and there's this chase, and they're like outdoing each other, trying to throw each other off so that they can get there first, and that's why I called it Cerberus. It's named after the mythical multi-headed dog creature that guards the entryway into the underworld. So in this sense, like the underworld would be under the ocean where the craft is with this advanced technology, and you've got contactees, you've got the military, you've got the aliens themselves, the a recovery craft sent from the alien civilization. You've got a private investigator who's the main character. I hope I'm not missing anybody. I think that's it. So you've got several different heads, so to speak, chasing after this one thing and trying to outdo each other. And that was for a college course. Um, so there was a personal arc with the main character. I don't remember what it actually was, whether he actually changed at the end or not. I remember he wanted to. I don't remember exactly what he wanted. It was like he was alone, I remember, and he something with a wife, like divorced wife or something. It sounds very cliche, but like he was alone and he was an investigator and he had the work to keep him occupied and so forth. And I don't remember whether he changed at the end or not. Um, I think he was basically trying to justify that what he was doing was actually serious work, and that it amounted to something, that it was truly worthwhile and he wasn't wasting his time. I think that's as close as I got to a main character concern. Um, and after that, James Bond satire. I mean, I don't know if there really. I think there was. I think there was a change. I don't think the main character changed. I think as I recall, it was something about the agency itself confronting the idea of it becoming outdated, and we don't need human agents anymore, and he proves them wrong. We do need agents, which turned up actually, I think, in an actual James Bond James Bond story or James Bond movie later on. My mom remarked to me about that, so I was a little ahead of the game. Maybe it was actually the Get Smart movie. I say that actually there are several Get Smart movies. The more recent Get Smart movie, um, feature film. Yeah, I think that was it. I think that was it. My mom remarked to me, "Hey, you had that too." um, so I so I started off with Acre and Utopia, where it was very much just inspired by this main character bonding with someone, and then I went to Cerberus and Sorry Wrong Movie, writing these large scale, objective story heavy stories. And then I got to the Madonna movie, Manhattan Masquerade, and I guess I had, initially, I had the character bonding element in there very strongly, and it carried through no matter what iteration I had of the objective story. The that bonding always stayed there, and it hardly ever changed. I mean, I added elements of Kabbalah into it, and the um, allusion to the Pharaoh and Joseph. Um, but it was always pretty strong. So I realized that I guess the way I write these things, it's either main character centric or objective story centric. So I go back to, so I watch Field of Dreams today, or I watch somebody's reaction to Field of Dreams, and that's uh, focused quite a bit on the main character, and it has emotional moments, so forth. So I wrote these desires or fantasies down. Um, Want to go back to relive um, time times out. I improve how much I want to improve how people know me. Oh, turns out I improve how people know me. Wanting to go back and relive some nostalgia, and what do I get out of it? Like, at the end of the story, does it turn out well? Uh, it turns out that I'm able to show people back then more of myself that I had previously kept hidden. Second one, meeting a celebrity and making a close friend, which is basically the Madonna story, but I removed that and I simply put down the fantasy or the desire. Wanting, and then the third one, wanting to not wind up a failure. Basically, what I'm doing, I want to wind up with something substantial, that I produced something that people remember me by, so that all this work is not a waste of effort. And then the fourth one, and these would be different stories, I imagine. I'm just writing down desires that I would want to put in, mold into stories. So they'd be individually different stories. The fourth one, standing up to mockery and humiliation. And the fifth one, wanting to know if parent was altogether healthy. And I have personal reasons behind that. It doesn't have to be idiosyncratic to what I experienced, but just the simple impression of knowing that your parent, wanting to know if your parent was okay all along. Um, and I kept these purposely vague so that they would be more universal, and that audiences in general would understand and appreciate. They would emotionally bond with them, and it would speak to them personally. So I have those, and then I have different milieus that I would like to write them in. Like, for example, if I had, for that Cerberus story, if I had more of a developed main character personal desire or need or want or conflict or dilemma, the UFO part would be the milieu, that would be the objective story. So I have some objective story elements that, things that I enjoy reading about or I'm fascinated by, that would be combined with, or matched up, more appropriately, matched up with these different desires. Um, so that's what I have, and I wanted to get that out there while it was still on my mind. It's late at night, and I'm going to call it quits for now. And I'll talk to you again later. Hopefully, you've been able to follow along this, and I'll talk to you soon. Bye.